I remember the first time I saw Harold standing near the old general store, holding a worn camera as if the whole town depended on what he captured. It was early in the morning, the kind of quiet hour when only a few lights were on and you could hear the cold settling over the street. I was 22, and most days felt the same. But the way he looked at the buildings, like he was studying something that might slip away, made me stop walking. I didn't know then that he had come from a place where my town was already gone. He didn't notice me at first. He kept taking photos of simple things: street signs, closed shops, the empty bench near the post office. Nothing unusual by itself, yet he moved with a sense of urgency that didn't match the stillness around him. When he finally lowered the camera and met my eyes, there was something tired and distant in his expression, as if he had traveled too far and for too long. We spoke only a few words that morning. He asked the date. He asked if the town always stayed this quiet. His voice carried a kind of disbelief, like he already knew the answers but wanted to hear them from someone who lived there. I didn't understand why a stranger would care so much about a place most people never noticed, but something about him made it hard to turn away. As he walked down the sidewalk, continuing his quiet routine of photographing familiar spots, I noticed that he avoided looking too long at people. He kept his attention on the town itself, its corners, its faded signs, its worn pavement. It felt as if he was searching for something that had once mattered to him, or maybe something he feared losing again. I didn't know it yet, but those simple photographs were not souvenirs. They were proof for a man who carried a timeline where my town didn't exist anymore. And before that day ended, he would show me why he had come back to this year, and why he needed me to understand what he had already seen. I didn't think much about Harold after that first morning. People passed through our town from time to time, usually on their way to somewhere larger. But he stayed. I saw him the next day near the harbor road, adjusting the focus on his camera as if every frame carried weight. He wasn't photographing anything remarkable, just the same quiet places we all walked by without thinking. Yet the way he moved, slow and deliberate, kept pulling my attention back to him. On the third day, he approached me. He asked if I had a moment, and before I could answer, he held the camera against his chest as if he needed support to stand. I noticed then how worn he looked up close. His hands were steady, but there was a heaviness in his expression, like someone carrying memories he didn't want to revisit. He asked my name. When I told him, he repeated it softly, almost as if confirming something. Then he asked if I had lived here all my life. I nodded. He seemed relieved, and that unsettled me more than anything else so far. We walked together for a few minutes. He pointed to buildings and asked small questions: when they were built, who owned them, whether they had changed over the years. I didn't understand the purpose of any of it, but he listened to every detail with quiet attention, as if each answer marked something important. It wasn't until he lifted the camera and showed me one of the photographs that I finally understood this wasn't an ordinary visit. The image he held didn't match the street we were standing on. It showed the same place, but stripped of life, faded, and strangely unfamiliar. That was the moment he told me the truth. My town didn't exist in his timeline anymore. Hi, my name is Luke. If you enjoy these quiet stories about time, memory, and the places we carry with us, I'd be grateful if you subscribe to the channel. What would you do if someone showed you a future where your hometown no longer existed? Thank you for being here and supporting these stories. Now let's return to the story. Harold didn't speak right away after showing me that first photograph. He watched my reaction with a quiet patience, as if he already knew how long it would take for me to accept what I was seeing. The picture looked like our street, the one that led down to the harbor, but it seemed empty in a way I couldn't explain. The buildings were there, but something about them felt wrong, faded, abandoned, almost erased. It was the kind of image that made you uneasy without knowing why. "Where did you take this?" I finally asked. He lowered his eyes. "Not here," he said. "Not in this year." I didn't know what to say. At 22, I had heard strange stories from people passing through. Fishermen, travelers, people who stayed in town for a day and left by morning, but nothing like this. I tried to hand the photo back to him, but he kept his hand at his side. "Keep it," he said quietly. "You might need it later." I didn't want to keep it. It felt like holding a warning I didn't understand. But he insisted, so I slipped it carefully into my jacket pocket. A small part of me hoped it was some kind of misunderstanding, a mistake in the camera, or maybe a place that only looked like our town. But the more I studied Harold's face, the less I believed that. We walked slowly toward the harbor. The air carried a faint smell of salt and cold, like it always did in early spring. People were opening their shops, sweeping steps, arranging items in windows. Life went on the way it always had. The sight of it only made the photograph harder to accept. "How long have you been here?" I asked him. "A few days," he said. "Long enough to take the pictures I needed. Not long enough to make sense of anything." He spoke like someone who had been traveling for years, not days. His eyes moved from one storefront to another, as if he was memorizing every detail. I caught him studying the cracks in the pavement, the small chips in the paint on the railings, the shape of the windows above the bakery. Nothing escaped him. "Are you looking for something specific?" I asked. He hesitated. "Yes, but it's not a thing. It's the feeling of a place that shouldn't still be here." I didn't understand. Why wouldn't it be here? He stopped walking. His shoulders dropped slightly, as though he wasn't sure he should continue. Then he turned to me. "In the timeline I come from, this town disappeared a long time ago," he said. "Not suddenly. Not in a dramatic way. It just faded. People left. Buildings were abandoned. Roads collapsed. Little by little, it stopped being a place anyone remembered. I came here because I needed to see it as it was before that happened." There was no shift in his voice, no attempt to exaggerate. He spoke with plain honesty, which made it harder to doubt him. But part of me still wanted to believe he was mistaken. "What caused it?" I asked. "Why did people leave?" He shook his head. "I don't know. By the time I was old enough to ask, it was already gone. My family talked about it sometimes, but only as a memory. My grandmother grew up near here. She used to tell me stories about these streets. I wanted to see them for myself." "So you came back in time?" He pressed his lips together, not in annoyance, but in a quiet acceptance that this conversation was difficult for both of us. "Yes," he said. "I traveled back to 1993 because it's the last year the town still looks the way my grandmother remembered it." The weight of his words settled slowly, like something finding its place. I couldn't stop looking at him. He didn't appear proud or excited. He looked tired, like a man who had finally reached a place he wasn't sure he deserved to see. "What happens next?" I asked. He exhaled softly. "That depends on why I found you." "Me?" "Yes," he said. "Every timeline I know where this town survives begins with a moment involving someone your age, someone named Luke." I felt a coldness settle in my chest. I had no idea what he meant. Harold watched me carefully, as if waiting for me to understand something I didn't even know I was part of. And then he said, "I didn't come here to save the town. I came here to find the one person who changes everything." I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure what Harold expected me to say, or what someone my age could possibly have to do with the survival of a town. It felt unreal, but he watched me with a kind of steady patience that made it impossible to dismiss him. He didn't look confused or unstable. He looked certain in a way that made me uneasy. "I don't understand," I said finally. "I've never done anything important. I haven't even left Maine." "That doesn't matter," Harold replied. "Most turning points aren't dramatic. They're quiet. They begin with someone who doesn't know they're part of anything larger." We had reached the end of the harbor road. The water was calm, barely moving, and the morning fog hung close to the surface. Harold stepped closer to the railing and rested his hands on the cold metal. For a moment he didn't say anything. He just looked out at the water like he was trying to remember something he had never experienced in this time. "Your town appears in old stories where I come from," he said. "Not many. Just a few lines in books people barely read anymore. But your name shows up more than once." "My name?" I repeated. "How?" "That's the part I don't know," he said. "But it was enough for me to come here. Enough to follow a faint trail before it disappeared entirely. I didn't know what to do with that. The idea that someone in the future knew my name felt strange and uncomfortable. I wasn't anyone special. I worked small jobs, saw the same people every week, walked the same streets my parents had walked. There was nothing remarkable about me. And yet this man, someone from another timeline, was telling me I mattered in ways I couldn't understand. "Did your grandmother talk about someone named Luke?" I asked. "No," he said gently. "She talked about this place, about the sense of it, the way it felt before it emptied out. But the name Luke, that came from someone else. Someone who tried to map the final years before the town faded. Map it? Yes. A researcher from my time. He studied forgotten places. He believed that when a town disappears, something is always left behind. A person, a moment, a choice. He wrote about your name, but he didn't know what you did or why it mattered. I couldn't look away from Harold. His voice was calm, not persuasive or dramatic. He wasn't trying to impress me. He was explaining something difficult in the simplest way he could. What if I don't want to be part of that? I said. What if I just want things to stay the way they are? That's exactly why you matter, Harold answered. People who try to protect what they know end up shaping more than they realize. A quiet settled between us, the kind that feels like a pause before something changes. I felt a tightness in my chest, not fear, but a growing awareness that my life might no longer belong only to the routines I knew. Harold slowly reached into his coat pocket and took out another photograph. The edges were bent from being carried too many miles. He held it out to me without speaking. The image showed the same harbor road we were standing on, but the buildings were gone. Grass and wild plants had grown over broken concrete. The waterline looked higher, as if the land had been pulled away piece by piece. There were no boats, no people, nothing left that resembled the place I had known my entire life. I stared at it for a long time. When was this taken? I asked. He hesitated before answering. In a timeline where you didn't exist. The words hit me harder than I expected. I felt the cold air more sharply, as if the world had shifted slightly. I didn't understand how any of this connected to me, or why a stranger from the future thought my presence or absence could change the shape of a town. Before I could speak again, Harold stepped back from the railing. I need to show you something, he said. But not here. There's a place outside town where the first change begins. If you're willing, we should go now. I didn't know what waited for us, but something in his voice made it impossible to refuse. I nodded, and he gave a small, tired smile, one that looked like he had been waiting a long time for this moment. Harold walked ahead of me at a steady pace, following the narrow road that curved away from town and toward the wooded area near the old quarry. I had been there many times growing up, fishing with my father, meeting friends after school, wandering alone when I needed space. It wasn't an important place to most people, but for me, it held pieces of the past. Seeing Harold lead me there made the morning feel even stranger. We didn't speak for several minutes. The only sounds were our footsteps and the occasional rustle of branches when the wind moved through them. The quiet felt heavier than usual, like the day was waiting for something. Harold kept his camera in one hand, swinging slightly as he walked. Every so often he looked around as if comparing the present to a memory he wished he could trust. How did you travel here? I finally asked, breaking the silence. He didn't slow down. The method isn't important, he said. What matters is the reason. I didn't come here for myself. For the town? For what it means, he replied. Places don't vanish without leaving something behind. People forget that. They think disappearance is sudden. It isn't. It begins with small changes, quiet ones. I need you to understand those before anything else. We reached a clearing where the trees opened enough for light to fall on a patch of grass. The quarry wasn't far. I knew the path well, but Harold stopped before we reached it. He studied the area with a careful expression, then turned toward me. This, he said, is where the first difference appears. I looked around. Everything seemed normal. The trees, the uneven ground, the faint smell of damp earth. Nothing felt unusual. I waited for him to explain. In my timeline, he said, this land was fenced off long before the town declined. The ground was unstable. Cracks formed across the open area. People avoided it. But here, in this year, the ground hasn't shifted yet. Why does that matter? Because change begins underneath long before anyone sees it, he said. A small shift here creates a long chain of consequences. Roads crack sooner, buildings weaken, people leave. They don't know why. It's never one reason. It's many small ones that add up. I tried to understand, but the idea felt too large. Harold saw the confusion on my face and softened his voice. You're not here to fix the land, he said. That's not your part. I brought you here because this is the first place where the timelines separate. He stepped closer to a large flat stone near the edge of the clearing. There was nothing special about it. I had walked past it dozens of times without thinking. But Harold placed his hand on its surface as if it meant something important. In my timeline, he said quietly, this stone broke in two during a storm. It exposed a hollow space underneath. Children found it. One of them got hurt. After that, people pushed for restrictions. The area was closed, and everything around it slowly emptied out. My grandmother left not long after. I looked at the stone again, trying to imagine it split open, the ground beneath it unstable. Here, it felt solid. "What does this have to do with me?" I asked. Harold took a step back and looked at me with a calm, steady focus. "You're the one who notices things," he said. "In the timelines where this town survives, someone your age sees the beginning of the change and speaks up. Not loudly, not dramatically. You notice something others overlook. You make a choice about it, and that small choice ripples outward." "I don't even know what I'm looking for," I said. "You will," he replied. "Not today, but soon." He lifted the camera again and took a single photograph of the stone. The shutter clicked softly, a delicate sound in the open space. Then he lowered the camera and said, "Luke, the town doesn't disappear because of one event. It disappears because no one remembers to care about the small things until it's too late." He paused, letting the words settle. "We still have time here," he said, "but only if we understand what starts the change." I looked down at the stone, then back at Harold. "I'm listening," I said, and for the first time since he arrived, Harold allowed himself a small, hopeful nod. Harold and I walked back toward town in silence. The stone, the clearing, the way he spoke about timelines, it all stayed with me. I kept thinking about his grandmother, standing in the same places I had grown up around, watching this town slowly fade in her memory. I tried to imagine the version Harold described, the quiet collapse of a place that meant nothing to the rest of the world, but everything to the people who lived in it. When we reached the main road, Harold slowed his pace and glanced at the familiar houses on either side. "Everything looks stronger here," he said quietly. "More cared for. Even the small things matter." "I never thought much about it," I admitted. "I guess when you grow up in a place, you stop paying attention." "That's how it always begins," he said. "People notice less and less. One day no one remembers what it used to feel like." We passed the hardware store, the diner, the narrow alley behind the old laundromat. Harold paused from time to time to take more photographs. He wasn't rushing. He moved as if every image was part of something he needed to build piece by piece, something he feared might slip away if he missed even one detail. "What happens to you after this?" I asked. "Do you go back?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the street, tracing the lines of the buildings, the shape of the rooftops, the small weathered marks that only someone who cared would notice. "I don't know," he finally said. "I didn't come here to return. I came because this is the last place that still feels whole to me." His voice had a quiet sadness that stayed with me. It didn't sound dramatic. It sounded like someone talking about a home they lost long before they understood what it meant. We reached the center of town, where the street opened into a small square with a bench near the post office. I sat down while Harold took a few steps forward and lifted his camera again. The click of the shutter echoed softly in the open space. "Why do these pictures matter so much?" I asked. He lowered the camera and looked at me. "Because in my timeline, there are no photographs of this place when it was alive. People stopped taking them when things started to fall apart. They didn't want reminders. I needed to see it before it changed." "And you came all the way here for that?" "For more than that," he said. He took a seat beside me, leaning slightly forward with his elbows on his knees. For the first time, he looked less like a traveler passing through and more like someone who belonged to the moment, even if only briefly. "Luke," he said, "there are versions of the future where this town ends quietly. No disaster, no single moment, just a slow forgetting. People leave, buildings close, small cracks spread. It becomes a place people talk about in past tense." I listened without interrupting. His words carried a weight that felt real, even if I didn't fully understand the mechanics behind them. "But there are other versions," he continued, "where the town endures. It's not perfect. It changes like any place does, but it stays. People stay, and every one of those versions begins with someone who pays attention early enough to change how others see things." "I don't know if I can do anything like that," I said. "You don't have to know now," he replied. "You only have to see what others overlook." He looked toward the end of the street, where the road curved out of sight. "Something begins there," he said softly. "Something small. You'll notice it when it happens. And when you do, pay attention." I tried to follow his gaze, but all I saw were houses and telephone poles, nothing out of the ordinary. "What am I looking for?" I asked. Harold gave a tired smile, not confident, but hopeful in a quiet way. Anything that doesn't match the place you've known your whole life. A sound, a change in the ground, a building that shifts, even a feeling that something is out of place. He stood, adjusting the strap of his camera. When that moment comes, remember this. The future isn't a straight line. It's a set of choices, and sometimes the smallest one is the first step that keeps a town from fading. He began walking again, leaving me with more questions than answers. But something in his voice stayed with me, a sense that whatever was coming had already started moving toward us, quiet and unnoticed. Harold didn't say where he was going next, but I followed him without questioning it. There was something steady about the way he moved, as if he had already walked these streets many times in different versions of the same world. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't wandering. He was observing, as if every detail carried a thread connected to the future he knew. We turned onto a smaller road that led past a row of older houses. Some were well kept, others worn from years of coastal weather. I had walked this road many times, usually without paying attention, but with Harold beside me, everything seemed to hold more meaning. He paused at a house with a sagging porch and took a photograph of the railing, clicking the shutter twice. "Why that one?" I asked. "It's weaker here," he said. "In my timeline, this house collapses earlier than the others. Small signs begin with structures like these." "You mean the wood?" "I mean what rests underneath it," he said, tapping the ground lightly with the tip of his shoe. "Foundations speak before walls do. People rarely listen." We moved on. His quiet observations made me look more closely at the neighborhood than I ever had. I could see what he meant. A small crack along a driveway, a slight tilt in a mailbox, a part of the sidewalk raised just enough to notice if you were looking for it. None of it seemed like enough to threaten a town, but Harold wasn't talking about disasters. He was talking about slow changes, the kind that slip by unnoticed until it's too late. As we reached the end of the road, he spoke again. "In my timeline," he said, "this block was one of the first to empty out. People said it didn't feel right anymore. They couldn't explain it. They just moved. And all of this starts with small things like that porch?" I asked. "Not the porch alone," he replied. "It's never one thing. It's what the small things signal. And when no one pays attention, the place begins to lose its shape." We reached a vacant lot where an old house used to stand. Only the stone steps remained, leading up to nothing. The town hadn't decided what to do with the land, so grass grew wild across it. Harold stopped there longer than he had anywhere else. He stared at the empty space with a look I couldn't read. "This place was important to someone in my timeline," he said. "A family lived here for generations. When the house collapsed, they left and others followed. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. One departure became another." I looked at the lot again, trying to picture the house that once stood there. I remembered a faded white building from my childhood, but it had been torn down when I was still young. I hadn't thought about it in years. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "Because this is the kind of moment where timelines begin to drift," he said. "A choice is made, a step is taken. Something changes without anyone noticing the weight of it. And what does that have to do with me?" He took a slow breath, steadying himself. "In every timeline where the town survives, someone your age becomes aware of what's happening here. They don't fix the problems themselves. They don't rebuild the town. They simply pay attention early enough to influence others. That doesn't sound like much. It's more than you think," he said. "Awareness becomes action. Someone speaks up. A neighbor repairs a porch. A road is reinforced a year earlier. A store stays open longer. Small things, Luke. Always small things." We stepped away from the vacant lot and continued toward the outskirts of town. The road narrowed and curved gently toward a cluster of pine trees. Harold slowed his pace and then stopped near a wooden fence that marked the beginning of a private property line. "This is where the shift begins," he said. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon." I looked around. The area seemed ordinary, quiet, still, unchanged. "What am I supposed to find here?" I asked. "You won't find it yet," he said, "but when it happens, you'll remember this place." He took a single photograph of the fence, then lowered the camera. "You asked earlier if you had a part in this," he said. "You do. And when you sense the first change, everything that follows will depend on what you decide to do." I didn't know how to answer. The weight of his words pressed into the silence between us. Harold didn't push further. He simply waited, as if he understood that understanding rarely arrives all at once. We stayed there for a few seconds more, listening to the wind move through the trees. Then Harold turned back toward town, and I followed, carrying a quiet awareness that something unseen was already beginning to shift beneath the familiar places I had always taken for granted. By the time we returned to the center of town, the sun had climbed higher, and people were starting their routines. Cars passed slowly along the main street. A few locals waved at me, and the smell of fresh bread drifted out from the bakery. Everything looked steady and familiar. Nothing about the town suggested a future where it faded into emptiness. Harold paused near the corner where the small grocery store sat. He didn't step inside. Instead, he watched the door open and close as people came and went. His expression was thoughtful, as if he was comparing the rhythm of this day to memories he carried from a different life. "Do you ever miss it?" I asked quietly. "Your timeline, I mean." He didn't look at me at first. He kept watching the store for a few seconds, then finally answered. "I miss what it used to be before it changed," he said. "But when a place loses its life, you don't feel homesick for it. You feel homesick for what you never had the chance to protect." I thought about that as we walked again. His words didn't sound heavy or dramatic. They sounded like something he had lived with for a long time. Too long, maybe. It struck me that Harold wasn't just visiting my town. He was grieving a version of it that never had the chance to survive. We turned onto a side street where a few small shops lined the sidewalk. One was a barber shop with its striped pole turning slowly. Another was a stationery store that rarely had customers anymore. Harold stopped in front of the stationery shop and held the camera up, taking a picture of the faded sign above the door. "This one closes early in my timeline," he said. People stopped buying the kind of things it sold. Letters, envelopes, simple supplies. It was one of the first signs that the town was losing its rhythm. "Do you think it will close here too?" I asked. "Not if the right things change," he said. "Places don't disappear because they are weak. They disappear because they are left alone." We continued walking until we reached a bench near the small public library. Harold sat slowly, as if he needed the moment to gather his thoughts. I sat beside him, watching a few kids ride their bikes down the street. "You said there's a moment when everything begins to shift," I reminded him. "Does it happen soon?" "Soon," he said, "but not today. There are still pieces missing. The timeline isn't fixed yet." I hesitated before asking my next question. "Why tell me all this? Why trust someone you barely know?" Harold rested his camera on his knee and looked at me with calm sincerity. "Because the timelines that survive always involve someone who sees what others overlook," he said. "I've watched this place carefully since I arrived. I've watched the people. You're the one who pays attention, even when you think you don't." I didn't know how to respond. His faith in me didn't feel exaggerated. It felt steady, grounded in something he had already witnessed in versions of the future I couldn't imagine. "How many versions of this town have you seen?" I asked. "Enough to understand the pattern," he said. "Most of them fade. A few endure. The difference between them is subtle, almost invisible. A person stays instead of leaving. A building is repaired sooner. A conversation happens that prevents another path. They seem small in the moment, but they create a different line of time. And you think I'm part of that?" "I don't think," he said. "I know." A quiet settled between us again. The breeze picked up slightly and I could hear the soft rustling of leaves near the library entrance. People walked by, unaware of the weight of the conversation happening only a few feet away. Finally, Harold stood and adjusted the strap of his camera. "We should stop for today," he said. "There's another place I want to show you tomorrow. It's farther out and we'll need time to reach it." "Another place where things start to change?" "Yes, but each place tells a different part of the story." He began walking down the sidewalk and I followed. The day looked ordinary, like any other in our small town. But Harold's presence had changed the way I saw everything. The cracks, the fading signs, the quiet spaces, they no longer blended into the background. They felt like warnings written in plain sight. As we reached the end of the street and went our separate ways for the evening, I realized something simple. I had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but I knew I wouldn't look at my town the same way again. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing the photographs Harold had shown me. The empty streets, the collapsed houses, the harbor swallowed by time. None of it matched the town I knew. Yet something about the images felt possible in a way I couldn't push aside. I woke early, long before the sun rose, and walked outside to clear my thoughts. Maine mornings always carried a quiet calm, but that day it felt heavier. The air had a stillness to it, a cold that settled against the skin without moving. The streetlights cast soft circles of light on the pavement, and the familiar houses seemed half asleep. Everything looked normal, and yet it didn't. I waited near the general store, the same place where I had first seen Harold. I didn't know if he would show up at the same time, but part of me expected he would. I watched the sky shift from dark blue to pale gray as the morning approached. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. Harold walked toward me with the same steady pace he always had. His camera hung at his side, and the expression on his face was focused, as if he was already deep in thought before he reached me. "You're early," he said. "I couldn't sleep." He nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Most people don't, once they start seeing the pictures for what they are. "I don't understand them," I admitted. "I don't know what they're supposed to tell me." "You will," he said quietly, "but it doesn't happen all at once." We started walking away from town, following the same direction as the day before but taking a different road. This one led past older homes, the kind built long before I was born. Their porches sagged slightly, and the paint was faded from years of weather, but they still felt lived in. Smoke rose from a few chimneys. Dogs barked in distant yards. Nothing suggested a future where these places no longer stood. Harold walked with purpose, though he didn't say where we were heading. The morning fog clung low to the ground, making the road look quieter than usual. After a few minutes, he spoke. "There's a reason timelines separate," he said. "It's rarely dramatic. It's never something people expect. It's small, almost invisible. A shift in attention. A moment where something that should be noticed isn't. And I'm supposed to notice it. You already started," he said. "You just don't recognize it yet." We reached a part of the road where the houses grew farther apart, replaced by fields and clusters of trees. Harold slowed as we approached a narrow path branching off the main road. "We're going this way," he said, stepping onto the worn trail. I followed him through the trees. The air felt colder here, and the quiet deeper. After a short walk, the trees opened into a clearing I hadn't seen before. It wasn't a place I recognized, and yet something about it felt familiar, like I had passed near it without realizing what was here. In the center of the clearing stood an old shed, small, weathered, forgotten. One of the walls had partially collapsed, and the roof sagged under years of neglect. I couldn't imagine anyone using it for anything now. Harold approached it carefully, walking around the perimeter before stopping near the broken wall. "In my timeline," he said, "this is where the first clear sign appears. This shed collapsed earlier than it should have. People ignored it. They said it was just old, but the ground underneath it had shifted. It meant something bigger was happening, but no one paid attention." I stepped closer, looking at the shed more carefully. I wouldn't have noticed anything unusual before, not without Harold's guidance. But now I saw it. The tilt of the structure, the way one corner rested lower than the others, the small cracks near the base. "It doesn't seem like much," I said. "It never does," Harold replied. "But these small changes mark the beginning of a path. In my timeline, no one questioned it. In yours, that might be different." He turned to me, his expression calm but firm. "Luke, I need you to see this place for what it is. Not just an old shed, but a point where every version of the future begins to separate. What happens here, what you notice here, decides what the town becomes." I looked at the shed again, feeling a slow shift inside me. This wasn't just about broken wood or sinking ground. It was about paying attention at the right time, and Harold knew it. He stepped back, giving me space to take in the moment. "Tell me what you see," he said softly. "Not what you think you're supposed to see. What you truly notice." I took a breath and stepped closer, feeling the weight of the future he carried settling into the quiet morning around us. I stood in front of the old shed for a long moment, trying to understand what Harold wanted from me. The structure looked ordinary enough: old wood, weak beams, corners softened by years of rain and wind. But the way Harold watched me made it clear this wasn't about the shed itself. It was about whether I could see what others would ignore. "I see the tilt," I finally said. "The corner on the left side sits lower than the others. And the wall, it looks like it's pulling away." Harold nodded. Go on. I crouched down near the base of the shed. The ground was damp, and when I pressed my hand lightly against the soil, it felt softer than I expected, softer than it should be. The ground is sinking, I said. Not much, but enough. That's the beginning, Harold replied. In my timeline, no one checked the land here. They let the shed fall. It didn't seem important, but the ground kept shifting, inch by inch. The changes spread. I looked around. The clearing seemed peaceful, but now I could imagine the subtle movements Harold was describing. A slow, quiet shift beneath the surface. Something no one would notice unless they were looking for it. How far does it spread? I asked. Farther than anyone realizes at first, he said. It reaches the edge of town a few years later. Roads crack early. Water lines shift. Small repairs get delayed. People start leaving one by one. Not because of disaster, because the place no longer feels steady. I stood and brushed dirt from my hands. And you think this can be changed? I know it can, Harold said, but not through force, not through warnings, through awareness. Someone sees the shift early enough to bring attention to it. Someone makes sure it's checked before the damage grows. He looked at me with a calm certainty that made my chest tighten. And that someone is you, Luke. I shook my head slightly. I'm not a surveyor. I'm not a planner. I'm not anyone important. You don't have to be, he said. Timeline changes never start with important people. They start with the ones who notice. The wind moved lightly through the trees. It wasn't cold, but the air felt different, like the kind of quiet that comes before a decision you don't yet understand. Harold stepped around the shed and pointed to the back wall. It had more cracks than the others, thin lines spreading outward from a single point near the bottom. The cracks weren't large, but once I saw them, I couldn't unsee them. These weren't here in every version of this year, Harold said. Some timelines stay stable longer. Others shift early. This one is close to the point where the paths separate. How do you know? I've walked enough timelines to feel when a moment is approaching, he said. Some are loud, some are quiet. This one is quiet. I watched him place his hand on the wood. He didn't look afraid or sad, just tired. Tired in a way that came from carrying too many memories of places that no longer existed. What happens if I don't do anything? I asked. The path follows what I already saw, he said gently. The shed collapses. The land sinks more. People shrug it off. A small decision leads to another. By the time anyone realizes something is wrong, the town is already fading. And if I do something, then the timeline shifts, he said. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but enough for people to pay attention. Repairs happen earlier. Roads stay strong. Stores stay open longer. People stay. One quiet choice becomes a chain that keeps the town alive. I took a slow breath. I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel chosen. I felt overwhelmed by the weight of something that seemed too big and too fragile at the same time. What if I'm wrong? I asked. Harold gave me a small, steady smile. Then the timeline adjusts. But you won't be wrong. You see more than you realize. That's why I found you. I looked once more at the shed, at the cracks, at the sinking earth. It still seemed ordinary, but now it held a kind of quiet importance I hadn't noticed before. What do we do now? I asked. For today, Harold said, we observe. The moment hasn't arrived yet, but it's coming. He stepped back from the shed, letting the silence settle around us. And when it does, he said softly, you'll know. We left the clearing and walked back toward town along the narrow path. I kept glancing over my shoulder at the shed, even after the trees hid it from view. It wasn't fear. It was the feeling that something meaningful had been placed in my hands without instructions. Harold walked in silence beside me, his steps steady, his gaze forward, as if he knew I needed space to take in everything he had said. When we reached the road again, the morning had opened into a pale light that softened the houses in the quiet yards. A few people were already outside, sweeping porches, feeding pets, carrying groceries from their cars. Everything looked normal, comfortable, predictable. It felt strange knowing Harold carried memories of the same town standing empty and forgotten. Was your grandmother the last person in your family to live here? I asked after a while. Yes, Harold said. She left before things reached the point where people stopped talking about the place. My parents heard stories when they were young, but by the time I grew up, it was just a name almost no one recognized. And you still came back. I wanted to understand why a place that once meant something could disappear so quietly. he said. When a town fades, people tend to blame large events, but more often it happens because no one connects the small changes before they grow. His voice carried no anger, no bitterness, just a calm acceptance of a truth he had seen too often. We passed the bakery, and the warm smell drifted through the doorway. Harold paused and looked inside for a moment, watching the owner move trays behind the counter. People talked quietly at the tables. The door opened and closed in a steady rhythm. It was the kind of simple scene most people wouldn't think twice about. In my timeline, Harold said softly. This bakery stood empty for years before it collapsed. I looked at the building again. It was old, yes, but it had life, light, people. The idea of it standing dark and abandoned felt wrong. What caused it to close? I asked. Small things, he said. Cracks in the foundation, roof repairs that were delayed, fewer customers as other places weakened. When the rhythm of a town breaks, everything breaks with it. We continued walking, moving through streets that were so familiar to me I could have walked them with my eyes closed. Yet now, every corner seemed different. I noticed parts of buildings I'd never paid attention to. The lines where the siding met the roof, the slight lean of fences, the way one set of steps had a subtle dip in the middle. Harold, I said, how many timelines have you seen where the town survives? A few, he answered. Not many. And in all of those, someone like me pays attention. Not someone like you, he corrected gently. You. His certainty unsettled me. It wasn't meant to. It wasn't pressure. It was simply the truth as he had seen it. We reached the small bridge that crossed the narrow stream behind the post office. The water ran quietly below us, the same as it always had. I leaned on the railing and watched the flow, trying to steady the thoughts that kept circling in my mind. What happens when the moment arrives? I asked. You'll recognize it, Harold said. Something will feel out of place. Not frightening, not dramatic. Just wrong in a way that doesn't belong to the rhythm of this year. And then, you pay attention, he said. You look closely, and you act in the smallest way that makes sense. The timeline doesn't shift through grand choices. It shifts through the ones that seem almost forgettable. I nodded slowly, letting his words settle. Harold rested his hands on the railing. In my timeline, no one noticed when the ground shifted behind the shed. No one spoke up when the cracks reached the roads. People assumed someone else would handle the small problems. Eventually, there was nothing left to hold together. The stream moved steadily below us. I watched the water push past the rocks, quiet and certain in its direction. I don't know if I'm ready, I said. No one ever is, Harold replied. But readiness doesn't matter. Awareness does. A soft wind moved across the bridge. Harold stepped back and adjusted the strap of his camera. We should head back, he said. Tomorrow the first sign may appear, or it may not. Timelines shift in their own way, but stay aware. The next days will matter. I followed him off the bridge, carrying a growing understanding of how fragile the future could be, and how easily small moments could reshape it without anyone noticing at all. The next morning I left home before the sun had fully risen. The sky held a muted shade of gray, the kind that made the world look quiet, but not empty. I walked through town with a kind of alertness I hadn't felt before, watching every sidewalk, every storefront, every shift in the pavement. Harold had told me that the moment would feel small, almost forgettable. That made me look even closer. I didn't see Harold right away. I checked the general store, the bakery, the square near the post office, but he wasn't there. For a moment, I wondered if he had left, if his part in this had finished, and he had moved on to another timeline. But then I saw him walking from the direction of the harbor, his steps steady as always, the camera hanging from his shoulder. You're early again, he said. I didn't want to miss anything. He gave a small nod, the kind that showed quiet approval rather than surprise. Good. Today might be important. We walked without speaking for a few minutes. There was a faint chill in the air, and the sound of distant gulls echoed above the rooftops. Everything in town looked the same as the day before. Familiar, calm, unchanged. Yet something inside me felt different, as if the ground itself carried a quiet tension I hadn't noticed before. Where are we going? I asked. Nowhere specific, Harold said. The moment won't be tied to a single place. It happens when the town and the timeline meet in a certain way. We're just moving through the day until that happens. His words didn't make the path clearer, but I trusted him enough now not to question it. We walked past the hardware store where the owner was unlocking the door for the morning, then past the old laundry building where the bricks carried faint lines of age. As we turned onto one of the residential streets, I noticed Harold slow down. He looked at the houses on either side with careful attention. "Something changed overnight," he said. I followed his gaze, expecting to see a collapsed porch or a cracked road, but everything looked normal. "What changed?" I asked. He pointed toward a small house with a short fence and a trimmed yard. A family lived there, a couple with 2 kids. Quiet people who kept to themselves. Nothing seemed out of place. "The ground near that fence," Harold said. "It wasn't like that yesterday." I stepped closer. At first I didn't see anything, but then I noticed it. A slight rise in the soil near the base of the fence. Not enough to call attention to itself. Not enough for the family who lived there to notice. But it was there. A soft, uneven mound where the ground had pushed upward. "That's it?" I asked. "That's the beginning," Harold replied. "In my timeline, this was the first shift people ignored." I crouched down, touching the soil gently. It was loose, softer than the rest of the yard. Anyone else would think it was from rain or natural settling. But knowing what Harold had shown me, it felt different, like something underneath had moved. "What happens if it's ignored here too?" I asked. "The ground spreads," Harold said. "The shift reaches the street. It affects the foundation of the house across from it. Then another. Small cracks appear. Repairs wait too long. People decide to move before things feel worse. And this starts the decline?" "In every timeline where the town fades, yes," Harold said. "It always begins here." I stood up slowly, realizing the weight of what I was seeing. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't frightening. It was subtle. So subtle that most people would never think twice. But Harold had shown me what the quiet changes meant. "What am I supposed to do about it?" I asked. Harold didn't answer right away. He looked at me with an expression that carried both hope and patience. "You're the one who sees it," he said. "That's the first step. But I don't know what to do after that." "You don't have to know yet," he said. "Awareness comes before action." He placed a hand gently on the fence, his fingers brushing the soft soil beneath it. "This is the moment," he said softly. "This is where the timelines begin to separate." A breeze moved across the street, quiet and cool. The town around us continued its morning routine. Doors opening, engines starting, people greeting each other without knowing anything had shifted. I looked at the mound of earth again, realizing how easy it would be to ignore it. Realizing why so many timelines had gone the wrong way. And realizing, with a quiet certainty, that this was the moment Harold had been preparing me for. I stayed near the fence for a while, studying the soft rise in the soil as if it could explain itself. It was small, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. But now that Harold had pointed it out, I couldn't unsee it. The ground had shifted, not violently, not dramatically, but enough to matter. Harold stepped back and gave me space. He didn't rush me, didn't push me to think faster. He waited the way someone waits for a seed to take root. Quietly and with patience. "What happened next in your timeline?" I asked, still looking at the disturbed soil. "The shift grew," Harold said, slowly. "By the time people noticed, they blamed the weather. They blamed old houses. They blamed anything except the land speaking early. And no one fixed it." "Not in time," Harold replied. "The fence cracked a year later. The foundation of the house across the street weakened. The road dipped just enough to create problems in the winter. People didn't leave because of one moment. They left because the place stopped feeling steady." I stood, wiping dirt from my hands. The silence around us felt heavier now. Not threatening, but full of meaning I couldn't explain. "Harold," I said quietly, "what do I do with this?" He turned toward me, his expression steady but gentle. "There isn't a single right answer. The timelines that survive don't depend on one perfect choice. They depend on someone noticing early and caring enough to act." "Act how?" I asked. "Talk to someone? Report it? Fix it myself? You'll know the right step when the moment comes," he said. "Awareness first, action next. Always in that order." His voice didn't carry pressure. It carried trust. A kind of trust I wasn't sure I deserved. We began walking again, moving down the street in a slow, thoughtful pace. I looked at everything differently now. The way the sidewalk dipped slightly near the corner, the uneven line where 2 houses met, the cracks that ran along the base of a mailbox. Not everything was a sign, but Everything had the potential to be. "Tell me something," I said after a moment. "Why me? Why not someone older, someone with more experience? Why trust a 22-year-old with something like this?" Harold didn't hesitate. "Because you still see things," he said. "Most people reach a point where they only notice what they expect. They stop questioning. They stop paying attention to the small shifts. You haven't reached that point yet. I'm just trying to understand," I said. "I know," he replied. "And that's exactly why you matter." We turned the corner near the small church, its white paint slightly faded from years of weather. Harold paused and took a photograph of the side wall, the same way he had done dozens of times with different buildings. The click of the shutter sounded soft in the still air. "You always take photos at the same angle," I noticed. He nodded. "It helps me compare. Timelines leave patterns. Sometimes the smallest difference appears in a change of light, or a shift in a window frame, or a crack that wasn't there before." "And have you seen differences here?" "Only in the ground near the fence," he said. "Everything else is stable, for now." His words made the air feel heavier. I didn't know if I was supposed to feel hopeful or worried. Maybe both. We continued walking toward the edge of town. The trees behind the last row of houses rose tall and quiet, their branches still bare from the early season. Harold stopped before the road curved out of sight. "Luke," he said, turning toward me, "what you saw this morning." That was the moment. I felt the weight of that settle in my chest. "I saw it," I said softly. "I actually saw it. And that," Harold said, "is the beginning of everything." A few cars passed behind us, the sound of engines blending with the quiet air. Life continued as if nothing unusual had happened. No one else knew the ground had shifted. No one else noticed the rise in the soil or the meaning behind it. But I had, and it changed something inside me. "What happens next?" I asked. Harold took a slow breath, the kind that carried years of memory. "Next," he said, "you decide what kind of timeline you want to live in." He didn't say it like a challenge. He said it like a truth he had learned the hard way. We stood there in the quiet morning. The town stretched out before us in familiar lines and fading paint, and for the first time in my life, I understood how fragile it all was. Not because of disaster, but because of silence, because of moments no one else bothered to see. We didn't speak for a while after that. Harold kept walking at his usual steady pace, and I followed a few steps behind, trying to make sense of what he had just told me. The idea that a small rise in the soil could mark the beginning of something so important felt unreal, but it also felt true in a way I couldn't ignore. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, how subtle it had been, how easy it would have been to step over it without thinking. Eventually, we reached the road that led back toward the harbor. The morning light was bright enough now to soften the shadows on the buildings. People were beginning their routines, opening stores, washing cars, carrying boxes from delivery trucks. Nothing about the town looked fragile or threatened. If anything, it looked steady, the way it always had. But all I could think about were the cracks Harold had shown me over the past few days. The worn porch railings, the shifting ground, the empty lot where a house had once stood. They weren't signs of collapse. They were early warnings, the kind that only mattered if someone cared enough to notice. Harold stopped near the bench by the post office. He sat down with a slow exhale, as if the morning had already taken more energy than he expected. I sat beside him, watching the quiet flow of people moving through the square. "You said the town disappears quietly," I said. "Not through anything big, just through people looking the other way. That's how most endings arrive," Harold said. "They begin when no one thinks they're important." I thought of the shed, the ground, the fence, the story he had told me about his grandmother's version of this town. It all felt heavier now that I had seen the sign myself. Small, nearly invisible, but real. What if someone else had seen it? I asked. Someone older, someone with experience. "They might have noticed," Harold said, "but noticing isn't the same as understanding. You didn't dismiss it. You looked closer. That makes you different." I didn't feel different. I felt uncertain, unsure of what my part in all this was supposed to be. "Do you ever regret coming back?" I asked. Harold rested his camera on his lap. "I regret that I couldn't protect the version of the town I grew up hearing about," he said. "But I don't regret being here now. Because of the pictures. Because of the timelines," he said. "Each one is a possibility. Most people go through life never knowing how small choices change the future. Traveling between timelines forces you to see that clearly. You learn that every version of a place carries a story, and some of those stories can still be changed. I leaned back on the bench, letting his words sink in. The weight of what he carried, memories from different versions of the same world, felt like something no one should have to bear. Yet he did it with a quiet determination, not bitterness. "What happens if I do the wrong thing?" I asked. "There is no single wrong thing," he said. "Timelines adjust. The danger comes from doing nothing at all, when no one speaks, when no one acts. That's when the path narrows." A delivery truck rumbled to a stop nearby. The driver stepped out, greeted someone, and carried boxes inside the post office. Everyday movements, ordinary moments. Yet now each one felt connected to something larger, something I couldn't fully see. Harold stood slowly. "There's one more place I want you to see," he said. "Not today, but soon. It appears different in every timeline. Sometimes strong, sometimes weak. It's the place that tells me how much time we have left." I looked up at him. "Where is it?" "The edge of the town," he said, "where the land meets the old road that no one uses anymore. In some timelines, that road holds steady for years. In others, it collapses early. The future changes depending on what people choose to notice there." "And you want me to notice it? I want you to see the town the way it really is," Harold said. "Not as a place that stays the same forever, but as a place that depends on the people who look closely." He gave a small, tired smile. "You've already taken the first step." As we began walking again, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not pressure, but a quiet understanding that the future wasn't distant or untouchable. It was already shaping itself in the ground beneath our feet, in the corners of buildings, in the choices we made without realizing their weight. And for the first time, I understood why Harold had come back to this year. Not just to take photos, but to find someone willing to see what others ignored. I didn't see Harold the next morning. I walked through town like I always did, past the bakery, the hardware store, the post office, but he wasn't in any of the usual spots. For the first time since meeting him, the town felt too quiet. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to hear his slow, steady footsteps or see him adjusting the camera strap across his shoulder. But the streets were empty except for a few early risers preparing for the day. I headed toward the road that led out of town, hoping I'd find him there. He had mentioned a place at the edge of town, the place that would tell him how much time we had left. If he wasn't in the center of town, he would be there. The walk felt longer than it should have. My mind kept drifting to the rise in the soil near the fence, the cracks along the shed, the stories Harold had told me about how things began to fall apart. Every small detail in town now felt like a piece of something larger, something fragile. When I reached the older houses near the outskirts, I finally saw him. Harold stood near the bend in the road, his back turned to me, the camera hanging loose in his hand. He wasn't taking photos. He wasn't moving at all. He was staring straight ahead, toward the stretch of empty land that led to the old road no one used anymore. "You found it?" I asked quietly as I approached. "No," Harold said without turning. "I'm watching it." I stepped beside him. The view was familiar. Fields, scattered trees, the long strip of road running between them. Nothing seemed unusual. "What are we waiting for?" I asked. "The change," he said. "It happens here at different times and different timelines. Sometimes earlier, sometimes later. It never looks dramatic. The land shifts, the road dips, the ground sinks by a fraction. But once it starts, it doesn't stop." I looked at the road again. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But when I focused, I noticed something subtle. A faint unevenness along the far edge of the pavement. It was the kind of thing you might blame on old construction or a long winter. Something that didn't feel urgent. That was exactly the problem. "Do you see it?" Harold asked. "I think so," I said. "The edge on the right side. It looks lower." Harold nodded. "Yesterday it wasn't like that. The shift has begun." The quiet around us felt heavier. I knew the town wouldn't collapse tomorrow. I knew nothing dramatic would happen in the next few days. But the beginning was here, just as he had said. "What happens now?" I asked. "In most timelines," Harold said. "Nothing. People don't see it or don't care. Repairs wait until the damage grows. A few years later, the road collapses during a storm. The town uses money from a small emergency fund to fix it, leaving nothing for the other problems that follow. And the town fades." "Yes," he said softly. Little by little, I felt a tightening in my chest. Not fear, responsibility. The kind you don't ask for but feel anyway. "Harold," I said, "I see it. I know it matters. But what am I supposed to do? I'm one person. I don't make decisions for the town." "That's the mistake people make," Harold replied. "They think only leaders change the future. But timelines shift when ordinary people speak up at the right moment." He turned to me then, for the first time that morning. His expression was tired but clear. "You don't need to fix the road," he said. "You only need to make sure someone who can fix it sees what you saw today. That's all the timeline requires from you. Just tell someone. Tell the right person," he said. "At the right time." I looked again at the road, at the faint dip I never would have noticed without him. It felt so small, so ordinary. But now I understood how small things became the beginning of something much larger. "Harold," I said, "what about you? What happens when this shifts? When I do what I need to do?" He looked away, back toward the empty road. "My part ends when yours begins," he said quietly. "Once the timeline has a chance to move in another direction, I don't belong here anymore." "You mean you'll leave?" "Yes," he said, "one way or another." The breeze moved across the field, carrying the cold with it. For the first time, I felt the day moving forward in a way I couldn't stop. The shift had begun, and now the weight of what came next rested with me. Harold didn't move for a long moment. He stood facing the old road, the line of it stretching out into the distance, carrying years of quiet history with it. I watched him, trying to understand the weight he carried. How many versions of this same view he had seen. How many times he had watched a timeline reach this point. "What made you come back to this year?" I asked. "Why 1993? He lowered his gaze to the ground before answering. "Because this is the last year the town still has all its pieces," he said. "After this, small changes happen that lead it down different paths. Once those begin, there's no going back." "Did you know you would find me here?" "No," he said softly. "I knew a person named Luke existed in the timelines where the town survived, but I didn't know which Luke. I didn't know age or face or story. I only knew that someone carried the awareness the others lacked. And you think that's me?" "I don't think," he said again. "I know." The way he said it wasn't heavy or dramatic. It was simple, steady, a truth he had lived with for a long time. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't feel special or chosen. I felt like a young man who had stumbled into something bigger than he wanted to admit. We walked a little farther down the road, stopping near a place where the pavement met a shallow ditch. The ground dipped in a way I'd never noticed before, barely visible unless you looked for it. Harold crouched down, brushing his hand along the edge where the pavement sloped. "This part gives out first," he said. "In my timeline, the collapse happened during a heavy rain. The water pooled here and pushed the soil away. No one fixed it because everyone thought the problem was too small to matter. They were wrong." "It doesn't look dangerous," I said. "It never does," Harold replied. "Not until it's too late." I stood beside him and looked closely. The soil looked dry, the pavement steady, but now that he showed me where to look, I could see faint lines reaching through the edge of the road. Small signs, the beginning of something. "You said the timeline changes depending on who notices," I said. "If I tell someone about this, if I point it out, is that enough?" "It's the first step," Harold said. "It doesn't have to be dramatic. You're not meant to fix everything. You're meant to start the right movement at the right time." He rose slowly, brushing dust off his hands. "Timelines don't shift because someone forces them to," he continued. "They shift because awareness changes the path of small decisions." "Who do I tell?" I asked. "Who is the person who matters?" "That part isn't fixed," he said. "It depends on what happens next, but you'll know. It will feel natural, not like a warning, not like fear. Just a moment where speaking up makes sense." I looked again at the dip in the road, then at Harold. "Is this why you've taken so many photos?" I asked. "To remember how the town looked before everything changed?" "Partly," he said, "but also to show the patterns to myself. When you've seen enough timelines, you learn to recognize the small signals. Photographs help me follow them." He lifted the camera, turning it gently in his hands. The leather strap had worn thin. The metal casing had scratches from years of use. It was a tool, but also something else, something that connected him to the paths he had walked. "You don't look like someone who travels through time," I said quietly. He smiled a little. the kind of smile that held both affection and sadness. "Time doesn't change people into something special," he said. "It just shows them what they overlooked before." We stood there in the quiet morning, the town resting behind us, the old road stretching forward. The air carried a soft stillness that felt almost expectant. "Luke," Harold said gently, "listen to me." I turned toward him. "When I leave, whether I walk away or disappear into a timeline that needs me, this moment will stay with you. Not because it is dramatic, but because it carries the first choice you make on your own." "What choice?" I asked. He looked toward the slight dip in the road. "The choice to care," he said. "To tell someone. To notice again tomorrow. And the day after." He placed a hand briefly on my shoulder, steady and warm despite the cold air. "That's all the future ever needs from us." Then he lowered his hand and we both looked out at the quiet road, knowing the next step belonged to me. Harold and I stood in silence for a long moment. The slight dip in the road seemed almost insignificant, just another imperfection among many in a small town. But I felt the pull of it now, the quiet truth behind everything Harold had shown me. It was never the size of the change that mattered. It was always the way people responded to it, or didn't. "Will you be here tomorrow?" I asked. Harold looked down at the ground before answering. "I don't know," he said softly. "Timelines shift once the moment is seen. Sometimes they draw me forward. Sometimes they pull me away." "You mean you might disappear?" "I mean I may no longer belong to this version of the year," he said. "I've stayed longer than I expected already." The wind moved through the tall grass near the ditch, bending it gently. I watched the movement, trying to imagine Harold not being here the next morning. No slow footsteps approaching, no quiet explanations, no calm voice telling me where to look. The thought left a hollow feeling inside my chest. "Harold," I said quietly, "what if I don't know who to tell? What if I say the wrong thing to the wrong person?" He turned toward me with a steady expression. "There is no perfect moment," he said. "There is only the real one, the one that presents itself, the one you feel." I sensed a deeper meaning behind his words, something he wasn't saying directly, something about how timelines choose their moments as much as people do. "You'll know," he repeated, "because you looked today. Once you look, you can't go back to not seeing." We began walking back toward town, moving slowly along the quiet stretch of road. The morning had warmed just enough to soften the air. A few birds called from the trees. It was the kind of day no one would remember years later. But for me, it felt like the day everything began to shift. "Did anyone ever help the town in your timeline?" I asked. "No," Harold said. "No one noticed early enough. By the time people cared, the damage had already shaped the years ahead." "That sounds lonely," I said. "It was," he replied. "A kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from watching others walk through a place without realizing it's disappearing." We reached the first house on the edge of town. The quiet routine of home life drifted toward the road. Someone washing dishes, someone calling a dog inside, a door closing softly. It reminded me of how fragile and gentle these moments were, how easily they could slip away. "I don't want this town to disappear," I said. "I know," he replied, "and I don't want to fail at something I never asked for." "Luke," he said, "you can't fail by caring. You can only fail by turning away." His words settled deep in me, heavier than anything he had said before, because I understood then that the future wasn't asking for control, it was asking for attention. We walked until the town center came into view. People were moving about, unaware of the shift beginning just outside their normal routes. I wondered how many small changes had gone unnoticed here, how many early warnings had slipped past generations. When we reached the bench near the post office, Harold stopped. He looked around as if measuring something, distance, time, or maybe both. Then he turned to me with a quiet finality in his expression. "This is where I leave you for today," he said. "Maybe longer. Will I see you again?" I asked. His eyes softened. Every timeline has its own answer. He placed the camera strap carefully over his shoulder and gave a small, tired nod, the kind that held gratitude more than goodbye. I watched him take a few steps away, his posture steady, his presence grounded even as the air around him felt thinner. "Harold," I called softly. He paused and looked back. "Thank you." He gave a faint smile, the kind meant only for a brief moment, then turned and continued down the street. I watched him until he disappeared around the corner, the morning light swallowing his shape as if he were becoming part of the day rather than walking through it. I stood alone in the square, the town moving quietly around me, the weight of the morning settling into my thoughts. The future felt both near and distant, uncertain, but no longer unreachable. I had seen the first shift. Now the next step was mine. I didn't see Harold again after that morning. Not that day. Not the next. Not even in the weeks that followed. At first, I kept expecting to turn a corner and find him standing there, camera in hand, studying the town the way he always did, quietly, patiently, as if every detail carried a piece of the future. But the days moved on without him, and the space he left behind settled into the routine of life in a way that felt strangely natural. It was as if the timeline itself had closed around him. Still, the moment he showed me, the small shift in the ground near the fence, the faint dip in the old road, never left my mind. I saw those places every day on my way to work or while running errands, and each time I felt the same quiet pull. A reminder, a responsibility, not a burden, but a kind of awareness that refused to fade. A few weeks later, I finally told someone, not with urgency or fear, just a simple mention at the right time to the right person, someone who listened, someone who cared enough to look for themselves. And from there, small conversations led to small actions, a brief inspection, a repair scheduled a little earlier than it might have been, a few neighbors talking about the ground shifting in that part of town. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make headlines, but small things mattered. Harold was right about that. Sometimes, late at night, I still wonder where he went, or if he stayed in some timeline I'll never see. I wonder if he knew how those quiet choices would unfold after he left. Maybe he did. Maybe that was why he came. All I know is that the town still stands, and when I walk through its familiar streets, I see the places Harold showed me. They haven't disappeared. Not in this timeline.